striking it is, frankly, that people are not seeing not only the materiality as an issue, but also that they can actually fulfill their fiduciary duties without considering decarbonization. Right?
Well, and those different pressures. That's exactly.
I mean, you've got.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for coming. It's 12:45, and I just wanted to take some time to introduce our next panel. So we're going to be doing businesses as a force for climate solutions. And next up,
I'm relieved. I'm not doing the electricity. I'm not doing
louder.
Yeah, I know, right?
So excited. We were replying to each other's tweets yesterday.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for coming to our symposium today. And I wanted to introduce our next moderator, Dean Mark Mahaly. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Mark Mahaly. I was dean here, and before that, and a professor, and now I'm professor emeritus. So we really have an interesting panel, and we have an interesting subject matter for the panel. So I was talking with one of the students at lunch. After all, lawyers make things work. The law is all about how do you do things. So this morning, we identified the problem. Of course, we all know what the problem is. But we identified the problem. This panel is about what are some of the ways that the problem is going to be addressed in the corporate world. I want to say just something about climate for a minute. I started working on climate issues in the 70s. And in the 70s and 80s and well into the 90s, environmentalists felt beleaguered because there was the economy as a field, everything to do with the economy, everything to do with the private sector, and everything to do with government on one side. And then there was this little thing called environment and environmental law. It was completely separate. And we felt that it would never change. It was obvious to everybody who was an environmentalist that the environment was everything. But no one believed that except environmentalists. And that's what climate change is changing. That's what climate change is going to completely overturn. Environmentalists have always wanted to be everything, and beware of what you wish for, because now we truly are. Because climate change, it's a truism to say it's going to change everything, but I want to talk about that just for 1 second. There's a tendency on all our parts to focus on now and not really think hard about the distant future. So even with climate change, which has dates like 2050, we're going to be here by 2050, right? You're always thinking about the future and worried we won't get there. But what you really think about is now. How bad the policies are of the Trump administration, how stupid the United States is being internationally on these issues. And because our emotional energy is focused there, in some ways it keeps us from thinking about the future. And I guess my view of the future is that climate change is going to change us, change our economy, change our entire polity. Everything about our civilization is going to change in dramatic ways, ways that are so dramatic that they will outstrip any change that we have seen before. We're going to reorganize the way we think, the way we teach, the way we characterize knowledge. You know, it used to be that you had the environment over here and then something like human rights, different subject matter. Climate change will fix that fast enough because the two are completely intertwined. Then there was climate change or the environment over here and a whole host of other subjects like the economy. Oh, well, there's the environment and then there's the economy. There's jobs and then there's the environment. All of that is going to collapse. And I really believe, for example, that environmental law as a field, like a lot of fields, will disappear as the realities of climate change force us to integrate completely the way we think about things. So when we talk about national security and war, we will be talking about climate change. Syria was one of the first climate wars. That will happen more and more. Food security will become an environment. One thing, you can't talk about one without the other. Energy, we've known that for years, energy and the environment all together. Well, one of the manifestations of this, I think, is climate change and the corporate world. I think corporations are going to change in ways that are even hard to imagine now. The way they are organized, the way that they approach the consumer, the way they interact with the energy and environmental world is going to change fundamentally. It may even be that the expected rates of return are going to have to change, that we will see an era with lower rates of return. And that is going to force investors and corporations and society to think differently. So suddenly the whole issue of the corporate world from an environmentalist perspective is a fascinating one. And because climate change is upon us. So our panel is a panel that's ideally suited for this. Our first speaker is going to be Betsy Schmidt. And Betsy, she's a professor at UMass Amherst, specializing in nonprofits and social enterprise. And if you don't know what social enterprise is, I'm not going to tell you. She will. She's taught here. She's practiced law, working directly for nonprofits. She's going to address structural issues. Jim Chen is a professor at Justin Smith Morrill Chair at Michigan State University, and he's got a quarter century of experience in the law of regulated industries and economics and regulatory policy. And in fact, National Jurist magazine, for what that's worth, Jim, but National Jurist magazine named Jim as one of the 25 most influential people in legal education. And then we have Hannah Vizcarra. Hannah is a staff attorney at the Harvard Environmental Energy Law program. And before coming to that program, she worked as a lawyer in Washington, D.C. She worked as a lawyer in a really interesting law firm that has many VLS graduates, Beveridge and Diamond, that is right in the middle of environmental issues. And her work for clients really relates to energy-related industries and the intersection of energy and environmental law. And last, we've got Noah Shaw. And Noah is the general counsel of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, a major, I would say, progressive player in the energy world and certainly in New York. And he's going to explain to you what the hell NYSERDA really is. And he's going to talk to you about their efforts, what they're doing in this field. So, Betsy, you want to kick this off? Here's your PowerPoint.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to the Law Review for a great and fascinating day. It's wonderful to be back at Vermont Law School. 10 years ago, as the Great Recession was unfolding, Vermont was the very first state to pass legislation that specifically allowed a type of business entity that would let the owners and the business emphasize both social and environmental good and the financial bottom line. In those 10 years, 38 states, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia, and 3 Indian nations have passed similar, or at least legislation with dual purpose, the social and the financial. And about 7,000 companies are now organized as either a benefit corporation or the L3C, which are the two most prominent of the new business entity forms that have been created. And so the people who have organized all of this are justifiably proud of what they've done. But 7,000 organizations is, yeah, what just happened?
We got
I can yell? I'm a professor, I can talk. Should I just keep going?
give her 1 minute,
Okay.
and then you had an extra 2 minutes anyway. Now we're going to. Should she keep going?
Okay.
Go ahead.
7,000 organizations is not really very many. Can you hear me in the back? When you consider that there are 31 million businesses in the United States. And the other thing that kept crossing my mind was neither one of these, the benefit corporation or the L3C, was actually designed in a way that they could possibly meet the purpose that they were done for. So I was trying to figure out what is this? And yet they're still going, they're still really proud. So I think that they're actually performing a different purpose than what they say they were designed for. Before 2008, we had gotten into a time where the idea of separating our, it's actually kind of similar to what Mark was saying. We were dividing things into categories and really couldn't think differently. You were either going to start as a nonprofit, a 501c3, or a for-profit. You'd be either an LLC or a corporation. By 2008, there were just rumblings of people saying, wait a second, I'd like to do both. What's wrong with making a good living and maybe giving some return to our investors and doing good for the world? And so the problem was, if you're a 501c3 and you try to get a little, it's hard to get money because the money's trying to, you can't incentivize investors. The money has to come usually as a gift, not entirely, but. And so they were saying, hey, we want to get involved in commercial activity, and then they would worry about losing their tax-exempt status by being too commercial or giving benefits to either individuals or the for-profit instead of to the charitable purpose. And because of this shareholder myth that people were talking about this morning, the people, particularly with corporations, we're thinking, well, we have to only make money. We've got to go pollute that river down there because we're going to make an extra, $1,000. So the Vermont, so here are the states that have the new legal structures. Vermont started the low profit limited liability company, the L3C, and Maryland was the first state to do the benefit corporation, but Vermont was the second. So, I mean, Vermont is in many ways, I believe, an incubator of good ideas. Although obviously there are problems with these ideas, or I wouldn't be making this point. But the ultimate purpose that I was saying that they did, I think Vermont has helped. So these people were designed to solve the financing problem of people trying to start these organizations. I mean, not only did the nonprofits have trouble doing it because they couldn't incentivize investors, but so in many cases would the for-profits have trouble because the investors were saying we're not going to make enough money. And so they found a really obscure part of the tax code where private foundations were allowed to make what are called program-related investments. And they were going to try to incentivize that. And they could also encourage some creative financing schemes, they thought. So they based the L3C on the LLC. So those of you who haven't taken business entities, an LLC is a business entity that can be created quite simply. It's now the most commonly used form in the United States, and a lot of the rules are, almost all of the rules are done by contract, so it's very, very flexible. And so they thought, okay, we're going to base this is why they call it the L3C. It's very, very clever. And in fact, low profit limited liability is a misnomer, because you don't have to be low profit. But they have 3 exceptions, and those exceptions are designed to make the fit perfectly with the language that the foundations would have to use for program-related investments. So they thought this was really, really clever and great, but there were some problems with it. First of all, there are absolutely no enforcement. There's no enforcement for it. So what basically happens is you file the LC form and click the box, yes, I'm following these 3 rules. So private foundations, who for 50 years, by the way, have been able to make these program-related investments, and they could make them to C corporations, LLCs, any kind of business entity, had no incentive to suddenly start going, oh, you say you're a good guy. Okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to give you an investment. And lo and behold, there haven't been very many program-related investments made to L3Cs. And they also said, okay, we've got this creative financing scheme where the private foundations can come in and be the first investor, and they invest $5 million, and they say, hey, we can take a low rate of investment because we're a nonprofit. But they and then the next investor comes in and goes, phew, now that company's stable, so I'm going to come in and make my 15% return on investment. Problem with that is, first of all, this was available with LLCs forever, so there's nothing new. And in fact, obviously with corporations too, there's just more. But they... And it's problematic for foundations, because the foundations should worry that the IRS is going to come and say, wait a second, you deserve some of that 15% return on investment. You are jeopardizing your financial future and giving your charitable money that should be going to charity to that other investor. So I just, every time I thought about this, I'm going, why did they say this is going to solve this problem? It can't. The Benefit Corporation has a similar issue. At dinner last night, I was talking about the Grayston Foundation with somebody. I can't remember if they're here, but this is the Grayston Bakery in New York. They don't employ people to make brownies. They make brownies to employ people, and they'll employ just about anybody right off the streets, and they're helping people who would not otherwise be able to get jobs. Very successful organization, and they are a benefit corporation. This was created by people who were actually more worried on the the officers and directors side, worried that if we're going to have other ideas, other purposes besides making money, they're going to worry about their liability. So we're going to create this benefit corporation. It's going to be based on the C corporation. So you have to, it's based on that form, basically. And then we'll have some exceptions. And what you're going to have a material, you have to put into your charter, you're going to have a material positive benefit on society. You're going to look at all the stakeholders, not just the shareholders. And you're going to be accountable, make these benefit reports to the public and be transparent about what you're doing. So that sounds wonderful. But it, again, absolutely no enforcement. And in fact, no prioritizing of the duties. So you could say, oh, this is the difference between the C corporation that goes, hey, assuming you believe the shareholder primacy theory, we've got to pollute that river. With a benefit corporation, you actually can follow the rule by saying, should we pollute the river? Okay, let's consider all the stakeholders. Maybe not a good idea, but yeah, we want to make the money. Okay, we considered it, and ultimately we're going to have a material effect on society. If there were some kind of accountability and these reports were really coming out, then we could assume that the public would enforce it. I mean, I really like the idea theoretically. Turns out because there's no enforcement, only about 15% of benefit corporations are actually doing their report. Ironically, I have not yet in 10 years heard of anybody saying these people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. So I think we really do have good people trying to do this. But again, there's not really enough information for the people who are already afraid of liability to get liability. And there's, and then there's, also the people who really need it the most are, if anybody needs this, the director protection, it's a public company. And to date, there's one public benefit corporation, Laureate Education, a for-profit education place, and they've had such bad PR that it probably does help to have a benefit corporation and a for-profit education. But the other one that they thought might become one chose not to because it's just too hard. So it's an interesting conundrum. I think the people who've been writing about these are either cheerleaders or they're very, very critical. And I'm kind of in between. I'm not sure whether it was intentional or not, but I think the original founders were actually politically very savvy. If you think about it, 38 states to say, hey, we're going to support you if you want to do both. You want to do good by doing, or do well by doing good, whatever that phrase is. But that's as far as the legislatures were willing to go. And you know, we are still in that state 10 years later. People are not willing to do an enforcement mechanism, which would cost money, or a tax incentive, which would also cost money. But these have been really big parts, I believe, of changing the conversation about the role of business in society. That's the role that they've played. They've gotten a lot of attention, and business is definitely changing. We heard that this morning. I'm sure we'll hear this afternoon. Even Walmart has some incredible goals that they're trying to get to by 2025, and they're really doing it. So they're giving voice to some really important value changes that are taking place in society. Elizabeth Warren, by the way, introduced into legislation recently I think it was, you probably remember this. I'm having trouble at the moment remembering exactly what it was, but I think it's that you're going to have to be almost like a benefit corporation to be chartered. That's not going to pass, but the fact that you could do that means things are changing. So we've got some big, and we now also have the legal framework that as things change, they can be modified when the political climate changes. So I think that's the role they're playing. I do think it's an important role, but they're not going to be able to do it to serve the purpose that they say that they're doing. I do think, as Mark was saying, that we're about to change, I hope we are, to where all we do is say, what if we all acted as if we lived on one planet? Thanks.
Next up, Jim Chen. This is working now, right? Yeah.
Okay.
You have a PowerPoint.
Oh, I don't have a PowerPoint, but well, I'm supposed to click to it.
Kill that, yeah.
Yeah, all right. So let me.
So we just close it.
It's a PDF, so it's really not a PowerPoint. All right. So the reason I did this is because PowerPoints are really just disaggregated, visually digestible versions of text. And I found it easier to write everything out. But this makes it easier for the law review to distribute this as a simple PDF, and anyone who really wants it can write me. But this is in virtually illegible form. And so what I will do is compound the illegibility of the text with the incomprehensibility of my oral presentation. All right. So this is really my contribution, I see, as that of something similar to what I've been privileged to do the last few years here during the summer at Vermont Law School, which is to teach the summer version of the course in environmental economics and markets. And this is a very condensed and unfortunately even more dismal variation on the theme of the dismal science, which is what economics historically has been called. So I will walk you through some of the environmental economics underlying greenhouse gas mitigation and hopefully the transition to a low in the immediate future and eventually zero carbon economy. All right, so let's start with what I'll call Ruckelshaus to Nordhaus principle. These are a lot of different ways of evaluating natural resource economics, and the big problem, of course, is that we're stuck with a carbon-based fossil fuel economy. It's wonderful to have renewables, passive solar, let's have wind. The problem is that these sources don't line up with the moments when human beings demand electricity. We also like to have cars, and until you figure out how to deliver electricity to cars without using fossil fuels, that too would be, you're basically stuck with a carbon-based electric economy. Not only do you have that, you're also putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the existing alternatives, the easily achievable natural gas, nuclear power for the base load, they're themselves exhaustible resources. So you can talk about the natural resources of depletion, you can talk about the economics of pollution, and you can talk about recycling. And then there's a velvet glove that you can put on each of these iron fists. You can say, well, depletion, but we can exhaust depletable resources as long as we're working toward renewable resources or renewable or less depletable, less destructive substitutes. We can talk about fund pollutants instead of stock pollutants. We can talk about, well, let's get the recovery rate on recyclable goods closer to 1. Folks, it doesn't matter. There is a dismal theorem at the end of this. Everything is exhaustible. All resources go to zero. And unless you actually preserve the physical flow of photons hitting the Earth and maintaining the ecosystem service of photosynthesis, you're going to die. And what is true of us as individuals is ultimately true of us as a society, as a species, and I'm channeling that great economist John Maynard Keynes. In the long, really long run, we are all dead. So that's the dismal theorem of Nordhaus. So all of the Ruckelshaus-style environmental law and platitudes that you want to assemble ultimately result in death. All right, so what can we do given this rather dismal prognosis and outlook? Look, here's some ideas, right? Here's one. How about not making the future less than the present? How about not grabbing the benefit of future generations and aggregating that to ourselves? Folks, we always eat the woodpecker. When you ask, why did you kill the last imperial woodpecker on Earth? Oh my God, you rediscovered the Lord God bird, the ivory-billed woodpecker. You're gonna eat it. Why? It's a big piece of meat, and we're hungry. How do we keep people from doing this? This is why I say these are just velvet gloves on an iron fist. It is said that true sustainability, Arnie Ness's deep ecology, requires the preservation of all existing physical flows. But if you throw in the corporate principle outlined by John Hartwick, oh, it's okay, as long as we reinvest the profits from immediate gratification, eating the woodpecker now, as long as we invest woodpecker rents, excess profits, into developing future substitutes, that's great. That's the so-called Hartwick principle, and you can soften the demands of sustainability. You can feel sustainable while enjoying meat, driving cars and generally being aggressive and consumptive. All right, here's the problem. Any time that you engage in so-called mitigating activities, all you're doing is committing immediate social productive uses to things that the future can't use. So if you flip the Hartwick principle on its head, all immediate consumption is by definition unsustainable. All right, again, we're getting nowhere except further depression. Let me try a different tack. What if we said, look, this is a law school environment. How many of you students have actually heard of the Coase theorem? Good. Vermont Law School is doing its job. This is a higher rate of Coase theorem awareness than I think any other law school. How about Coase's, can you name anything else Coase ever wrote, by the way? Nature of the Firm, people who take, no, not one. Okay. Coase theorem. Let me sing it to you. Law is worthless, this I know. Coase's theorem tells me so. Rights and duties can be sold. This moral kiosk sure is cold. Yes, law is worthless. Markets are ruthless. Law, rights talk is worthless. The theorem tells me so. Okay, so that is the semi-religious belief that markets will take care of everything. Of course, this assumes a frictionless, physically impossible, economically impossible setting where there are no transaction costs. The nature of the firm says that, look, you don't have to, why do we even have individual corporations? Why don't we just have a single giant Stalinistic Russian, Soviet-style central ownership, right? Might come back in an age when, the national slogan is Patria Trampa, Patria Trampa, Sina Narodnaya. For those of you who haven't learned the future new national language, that means the party of Trump is a national strength. Okay, so much for my, I've exposed myself as an enemy of the state. I will be exiting soon. In between the nature of the firm and the Coase theorem, and I know no one here has heard of the Miller-Modigliani theorem. And here what we're saying is that the corporate entity, all corporate structure is irrelevant the way that all tort law is irrelevant under the Coase theorem and all competition law is irrelevant under the nature of the firm. It's irrelevant in the sense that the firm is only there as a way of reallocating risks. Who likes to be paid first? In that case, what you should do is you should buy the bond, or at least buy the preferred stock. Otherwise, you can be the common shareholder and receive all the upside, but you also have to wait for any gain. Now, why does this matter? Because in our country, at least for now, all utility companies, for the most part, just as soon as I said all, I realized that's not true. I'm lying. That's okay. I'm still at the rate below that of the president. I'm lying only to this extent. Unless you are a municipal-owned utility or cooperative, you are a shareholder-owned utility, and shareholders like to make money. So how do you make money? Well, this is the interesting problem. We need somehow to marry these principles of law and economics, what is taught in environmental economics at markets, with the broader economics of ecology and of sustainable development. And here's some thoughts about how we can do this. Now, one of the problems in technology forcing in environmental law, if you think about things like best available technology or best available control technology, right? Section 109 of the Clean Air Act, CAFE standards. Here's one little assumption that we've always adopted, and it's basically Coase, nature of the firm, not the Coase theorem, problem of social cost. We assume that there is a nirvana-like state where, but for the corporation, there is a competitive marketplace ready to take its place. Let me channel Michael Cohen. Says who? Who actually told you that alternatives to the corporation are actually competitive? But we assume this, and this is the fabric of environmental law, with one huge exception: the law of regulated industries and the financing of the regulated firm, the utility that actually has to make a profit, because guess what? The public utility is anything but. That is one of the biggest lies in American law. The public utility is a private corporation that likes to make money, and it likes to attract investors, and those investors demand a return. Now, I could spend the remaining time I have up here to tell you about, conventional rate of return, which is the rate of return times the rate base plus operating costs, or my preferred price level regulation, which is base price times the big pie compounding of 1 plus the rate of general inflation minus the X factor, or a industry-specific cost index. Wow, 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 wow. I can also tell you about the Ramsey equation and how it combines immediate gratification, pure impatience, with a growth factor. If you listen carefully to all of that economic gobbledygook that I just dropped on you, and I could have written it up in equations and walk you through the math, it comes down to the same thing. You need to combine firm-specific profits with an element accounting for general growth of the economy, plus a projection of impatience and people waiting into the future, not knowing what that future is going to be. And because you're pushing people into the future, you're now asking them to gamble on pure uncertainty. And in the context of climate change, there's scientific, technological, economic, legal, and political uncertainty. That is 5 horsemen of the ecological apocalypse. Oh, and by the way, this assumption that there's going to be a competitive market has now also been flushed down the non-compostable toilet, since we are at VLS. Instead, what we have is now a head-to-head battle between the renewable portfolio standard and the feed-in tariff. And generally speaking, I know this is really compressing, the renewable portfolio standard is America first. It is the preferred model in the United States because we've tried the feed-in tariff. We tried this with qualifying facilities under the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, or PURPA, and we decided, frankly, it was too socialist. So, of course, Germany and the European Union prefer the FIT. Now, here's the basic issue, and boiling everything down to the following observations. The renewable portfolio standard, unlike let me start with the FIT, because we've had this experience. The FIT uses a forced price by the regulated utility for the specific purpose of changing the competitive structure of the feed-in industries, the ones that are delivering base generation to distribution in the electric industry. So what we see is we're actually using empire, or the concentration of wealth in a regulated but privately owned industry, to actually induce or incentivize, never say incentivize feed-in innovation at lower chains of, lower levels of the energy supply chain. The renewable portfolio standard actually adopts the competition nirvana fallacy of the rest of the fabric of American environmental law. We just assume that, well, if we say you have to buy renewable portfolios, that somehow magically the industries developing that supply chain of renewable energy, aside from the currently carbon-heavy base load, will somehow be competitive. This is a dismal choice. Either you assume there is competition, which there is not, or you assume that the only way to get competition is through more monopoly. Nice dismal choice. I'll end with a couple of suggestions. It has been said that, it's a grim but false choice between having economic development and having sustainability. I'll give you 2 more names. The environmental Kuznets curve suggests that yes, in the short run, we will pollute the environment and eat the woodpecker. But if we make people wealthier in the aggregate, they do tend to look forward and actually try to think of sustainability. And finally, Michael Porter's induced innovation hypothesis does suggest that these tools for forcing technology, imperfect as they are and as heavily as I have mocked them, do in the aggregate and in the long run induce more innovation in the hopes that we may get there. Unfortunately, that's the long run, in which case we are all dead. Thank you.
Hannah, that's the act you're following.
Well, I'll just start by saying I'm sorry. I will not be nearly as entertaining, but hopefully I'll bring something useful to this discussion as well. As Mark mentioned, my name is Hannah. I was with Beveridge and Diamond most recently, but I practiced law for a little over 7 years before very recently moving to Harvard's Environmental and Energy Law program. So this is all a bit of a new world for me, and you'll have to forgive my focus is changing and developing as we go. I'm going to take us back. Actually, before I do want to say thank you to the Vermont Law Review for bringing me out here. This is actually my first time in Vermont, and I'm very excited to be here. But it's not my first time receiving maple syrup as a gift from a Vermont person. Way back when, before I was an attorney, I spent some time, I did a brief stint working for Howard Dean when he was in charge of the DNC, and he also gave me maple syrup, as well as everybody else on staff that year, so nothing particularly special. I'm going to take us back to some of the discussion from the earlier panel about securities law and institutional investors, and particularly some of the things brought up by Dr. Lisa Benjamin around institutional investors. As she mentioned, in 2015, Mark Carney of the Bank of London spoke of the tragedy of the horizon and pointed to the profound implications of a changing climate on financial stability and the economy. His speech is often pointed to as something akin to the investment community's debut on these issues, and that this coming out happened in the same year as the Paris Agreement, and which was, of course, expected to be a decisive move towards serious GHG reductions by the world's largest economies. We'll see where that really goes in the long run. But Carney's speech and the Paris Agreement are not the beginning of the story. Shareholders have been pressing companies for more expansive disclosure on climate and environmental risks for a number of years. The SEC actually released guidance in 2010 clarifying that, yes, environmental risks should be taken into account when you consider what is material for the purposes of your financial disclosures. The commission outlined some general concepts around how that should be done, and companies went on to incorporate some basic information on regulatory changes, pending litigation, and the like, and I got the opportunity to write some of those things back in the day, or at least review what the corporate lawyers had written as an environmental attorney and let them know that maybe some other regulatory changes were coming down the pike that they should consider including. But they didn't necessarily provide insight into their long-term management of climate risks. And that's where I think we're seeing the shift. Meanwhile, activist shareholders pressed companies to conduct more robust assessments and prepare reports, and a range of outside organizations have grown up to really pressure companies to participate in voluntary disclosure efforts. They've just created ratings organizations and questionnaires, and the variety of those is pretty expansive, and their quality certainly varies. And really, the sheer number is proving quite challenging for companies to manage and to navigate and figure out what's important and what do investors find useful for the purpose of making their decisions. But all this points to a belief that companies have something to offer in this space, that they can make a meaningful climate impact outside of government regulation-induced change, maybe not get you all the way there, but certainly have some sort of impact. And these impacts, as we've heard, are not necessarily just about the larger social good, but also about benefits to shareholders and particularly those interested in longer-term returns and the long-term survival of industries or individual corporations that they've invested in. And there is some scholarship out there that's in development or has been published in the last few years around this issue of connecting these types of disclosures and risk management efforts to shareholder returns and improved profitability of companies. I'm not going to get into that today, but it's certainly something to look out for. And there are, I think George Serafim at Harvard Business School has done some work in this area. The SEC returned to the game in 2016 when they sought comments on modernizing the disclosure framework. And they received comments urging them to include specific requirements for disclosure on environmental and climate risks. They also received comments that from others that were concerned that such disclosures whether those disclosures would be properly tied to the bedrock principle of materiality. And that is whether there is a substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would consider the information important when making investment decisions or voting decisions with regard to the company. As far back as 1975, SEC talked about environmental issues. They stated that the disclosure of environmental and social issues could be required in certain circumstances if it were material and if it was necessary to ensure that statements weren't otherwise incomplete or misleading. And you definitely heard some about that in the panel on litigation, and this is a burgeoning and continuing area to focus on. In the current political climate and just where things are with the SEC, I wouldn't expect any major new guidance or disclosure requirement changes. Other issues like conflict minerals have been the subject of specific requirements, but those were imposed by Congress. And environmental and larger climate issues haven't faced such haven't been the beneficiaries of such action. So they remain subject to these general principles of securities law, which we talked around a little bit earlier in the day. So in comes TCFD. In an effort to standardize and elevate the quality of corporate disclosures internationally, this is not entirely focused on the US, around climate change risks and opportunities, the G20's Financial Stability Board established the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures in 2015, and Dr. Benjamin talked pretty significantly about this. And this is, she mentioned it's an industry-led task force. Michael Bloomberg chairs it. It's still in existence. And it was charged with investigating the current state of disclosures and providing recommendations for improvement. They released their report in June, I think it's June or July of 2017. So we've had a little over a year to digest it and see what people are going to do with this. They issued 4 primary recommendations: that organizations disclose their governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. Don't forget the opportunities. I'm not really going to talk about them today, but anytime you talk about this in a corporate environment, not only considering what this is doing, what risks they're facing as an institution, they're also thinking about what opportunities are out there that they could potentially benefit from. So the first was about governance. The second was that they disclose actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on the organization's businesses, on their strategy, and on their financial planning, where material. And then that they disclose how the organization identifies, assesses, and manages these risks. And finally, the metrics and targets used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities, again, limited to where that is material. So this 2017 report was sort of a galvanizing force on these issues. The TCFD recommendations have served to focus the work of investors, of companies, and of standards and ratings organizations by getting them really to speak the same language and talk about the same buckets of issues. Instead of having all these organizations out there trying to pulling companies on different metrics for their questionnaires, everybody's at least trying to say that their work fits within this framework or realign what they're doing to fit within it. And we're seeing organizations do that, revise their questionnaires and standards. Hundreds of financial and non-financial firms, including oil and gas companies, jumped out pretty quickly and loudly to declare their support, or at least their alignment in interest with TCFD's recommendations. Some have begun to incorporate them into their reporting and disclosure practices. Many are still grappling with how to do that. And to what extent this has occurred already really remains an open question. Since the release of TCFD's report, we've seen some action in the regulatory community and legislatures, really internationally, not here, more in Europe. There have been some consideration of how to incorporate the recommendations into regulatory schemes in the UK and elsewhere. But really, Mark Carney's speech wasn't particularly substantive from a legal analysis perspective or a law professor's perspective, but it can be seen as, it can be seen as sort of a type of theater, but it's that theater that signaled a move into the mainstream. Since Carney's speech and the Paris Agreement, momentum around this issue has picked up, and investors are demanding more disclosures, and slowly the corporate culture is adjusting to their calls. I think it's notable that US-based entities do not seem to be pulling back from their initial public displays of affection for the TCFD recommendations, given that happened before the last election, right? And they're still talking about these issues. They're still talking to investors about these issues. You're seeing BlackRock and others come out and say, no, we're really serious about this. We do want to consider these issues. And so where does this leave us? The remaining impediments to implementation, there remain impediments to implementation even with this wave of enthusiasm. And if we look back at the recommendations from the TCFD themselves, there are a few areas that, to me, jump out as barriers for meaningful and quick implementation. And my primary areas of interest in this are materiality, which I've mentioned a little bit already, and what disclosure of metrics and targets really looks like for companies and how they can feasibly satisfy the desires of investors in that area. So first, talking about materiality, the recommendations limited the disclosure of actual and potential climate impacts and metrics and targets to when they were deemed material. And keep in mind that TCFD's recommendations are entirely voluntary. They aren't trying to, but they're spawning this discussion. And materiality is determined internally by companies with board oversight. There are many factors that come into play in determining whether a particular issue rises to the threshold of materiality for disclosure purposes. And what I want to know right now is what really is material these days anyway. Is this an evolving standard? Are we seeing the beginnings of an evolution in the standard? It's tied to what you call a reasonable investor. If there truly is widespread interest in climate risk by institutional investors and they are acting on that interest, as they say they're going to, then does that begin to impact what a reasonable investor looks like? There's also the question of just your public stockholder, just general common share stock. We're increasingly concerned, individuals are increasingly concerned by wildfires faced with the ravages of hurricanes over and over again, as we're seeing today, and more intense weather. And do they need to consistently state an intent to make an investment decision based on that concern in order to change what the picture of a reasonable investor looks like? Another aspect of the equation is whether that information would alter the total mix of information. And this is, if you take securities law, you'll hear about these concepts. I did not take securities law in law school, so I learned about them later. But how do climate risks play into that equation? Are they significant enough in the array of issues that investors are considering to move the needle in some way? Mark Carney says yes, and he's trying to lead a path in that direction. How does that play in with voluntary disclosures in the discussion that we heard earlier of potential omissions in by not including this information, leading to potential litigation or a question of whether your disclosures are misleading? On the issue of metrics and targets, I think the real issue here is that there's a gap between the information that institutional investors would ideally like to see and what corporations think that they can provide, and that really hasn't been well delineated yet, or at least not in certain industries. Companies appear particularly concerned around, one of the aspects of this that if you read the TCFD recommendations, you'll see is that scenario analysis plays into this and is particularly important. And that, I don't have time to really explain that, but is one of the main concerns, I think, for companies around this area. So they're really talking about the how. How does this work? What do you want to see? Investors want to see something uniform that they compare across different companies. Does that makes sense in the world of scenario analysis, which is very particular. When TCFD is saying that you should have some sort of aspect of scenario analysis in the metrics that you're disclosing, that's not necessarily comparable. Or what does it look like in order to be useful for an investor? So as a former practitioner, I believe that clarity is needed on some of these simple questions of what investors want to see in disclosures and what practical challenges companies face in disclosures, in expanding their disclosures. And I'm interested in these questions of even well-intentioned corporate clients and what they would ask if they came to me as their attorney about how to achieve these lofty goals of meaningful, expansive, and decision-useful disclosure when the legal standards at play are very individualized and fact-based determinations. So their first question is, how do I do this? How does this work for my company, and what are the potential legal risks and the parameters within which I'm playing? So I don't have an answer on that. I think these are the questions people are starting to ask, and this is certainly the first question that I'm trying to address with my work at Harvard, and we're really just, as you can tell from my presentation, starting down this path. But we're not the only ones working in this area, and there are others tackling bigger picture questions such as assessing the most effective way to influence corporate actors. Is this even effective in the long run? But these foundational questions, the how questions, have to be addressed before corporate actors can even move past them to the conceptual support of implementation. They're not going to start down the path. They may talk about it, they may make public statements, but until you can answer the basic legal question of how do I implement this, what becomes material in this context, how do I incorporate scenario analysis, this large and technical and difficult thing, into something that does, and then disclose it, will that confuse investors, then they really won't make significant moves. We have companies saying the right things, espousing an interest in addressing climate outcomes. I think it falls to us in the legal community to help provide them with a roadmap for navigating the potential pitfalls in getting off the starting block. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Noah?
Thank you, Dean. Hi, everybody. Are your brains full yet? I will try to be quick because rather have a back and forth than talk. But I will try to provide a little bit of a outline of me and what we do in the state of New York and how it aligns so well, I think, with this panel. I've been trying to figure out how to work woodpeckers and death into my talk, so stick with me and just wait for it. So I'm Noah. I'm the general counsel of NYSERDA. Dean Mihaly sort of described what NYSERDA is. It's got a bit of an outdated name. When people ask me what it is, I basically say it's the Department of Energy for the state of New York. New York being the 13th biggest economy in the world, we have a large impact. We have a suite of different programs ranging from the Green Bank, which some of you may have heard of, which is a division of NYSERDA, to straight up R&D work that we do and giving out awards to develop different kinds of technologies. We also have a very large portfolio of what we call market development programs, which means thinking about how to change the playing field for businesses so that they can actually make money and more money doing what we want them to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We also happen to oversee the state's only high-level nuclear waste site. So there are it's a very large organization. We have about 400 employees. Our funding streams are from ratepayer collections. So if you look on the back of your electric bill in basically any state, you'll see a whole bunch of little tiny charges with funny acronyms, 15 cents, 30 cents, $1.50, whatever. All of that money goes into pots of funds that then get distributed to either, in some places, utilities to run programs that the state requires them to run to reach our goals, or in New York, half of it goes to NYSERDA. We also are funded through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So when companies pay for allowances to emit, dirty stuff into the atmosphere, carbon, that money then goes to NYSERDA to reinvest in the clean energy economy. So that's sort of what NYSERDA is. We work very, very closely on the state level, obviously, with the governor's office. We're an agency of the state. But also, and I think this gets a little bit into the meat of what I'm going to talk about, really at the intersection of government policy and the private sector. So in New York, we have this thing that some of you may have heard of called REV, the Reforming the Energy Vision. It has sort of taken lots of forms, but the way I like to explain it is that it has sort of it's a stool with three legs. The first leg is regulatory. So the Public Service Commission makes rules and issues orders that try to change the incentives for especially the utilities. So for example, there are lots of examples, and Jim will probably tell me that none of them actually work and we're all going to die. However, one of them was what we call the Brooklyn-Queens Demand Management Project. So Con Edison, which is the big utility in New York City, came to the Public Service Commission and said, hey, we need to build a new substation in Brooklyn-Queens load pocket, we call it, because there are lots and lots of people moving into Brooklyn and Queens, and they all want big TVs, and the load is increasing, and our system just can't support it. We can't push enough electrons through. We need to build a $1.5 billion new substation so we can take more electrons from, nuclear plants upstate and shove them through one way to Brooklyn, and that's how we're going to solve our problem. And we need you to rate base that. We need you to approve us raising our rates so that we can pay for that. And when we said, the state team said, well, no, we're not going to do it that way anymore. What we're going to say is instead of building that substation, we want you to issue a solicitation for distributed resources solutions, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's storage, whether it's distributed resources on the grid. And you're going to solve your load problem that way instead. And Con Ed bitched and moaned for a while, but eventually they did it. And they did solve their problem, and they did it for about $750 million instead of 1.2 or 3 billion. And so in that way, we can achieve multiple purposes. First, we can help, although not solve, but help our grid problems as load increases. Second, we can actually decrease costs to ratepayers. And third, we can incentivize clean energy and energy efficiency on the grid. Now that is Brooklyn, Queens, not a small area. It's probably like 10 times the size of all of Vermont, but it is a relatively limited example, but that is a good example of what we're trying to do statewide through REV. And NYSERDA's role in all of that is to make sure that the private sector has the ability to bid into that solicitation, right? So there are energy storage companies out there who would love to be able to figure out how to offer a solution that's actually big enough and robust enough and investor worthy enough to be able to take on the challenge of solving that problem for Con Ed. Or there are energy efficiency companies who would love to have the capacity and the resources and the business acumen to be able to sign up for that sort of a commitment. But they can't right now because those markets aren't mature enough. So what NYSERDA does is, through our market development activities, is help solve those problems. So we look at different kinds of business models. We look at different sorts of resource allocations. We work with the private sector and take some of that risk on the front end, right? So investment is hard. Private sector folks don't want to invest in things that don't have a track record. So for example, what the Green Bank does, its entire mission is about taking not necessarily new technologies, but new business models that folks at Citibank or whatever don't want to invest in because they're too risk averse. So we take some of that risk through credit support mechanisms or other sorts of guarantees to make the private sector sort of come in the first couple or three times, and then after that market gets developed, the idea is that it's off and running, because government will never have enough money to solve the problem, even close, not even within a day's ride. So NYSERDA has a 10-year budget of $5 billion just for the Clean Energy Fund, which is this sort of suite of market development activities. That seems like a lot, right? Well, in order to reach even 15% of our 40% by 2030 greenhouse gas reduction goals, we need a leverage ratio of 3 to 1 in the private sector on that. So dumb lawyer math, right? So $5 billion, we need 3 to 1 leverage ratio. That's $20 billion total. That gets us to 15% of our goal. That means that even dumber lawyer math, in order to get to 40 by 30, it's at least $150 billion of investment just in the state of New York to make that work. Now, costs are changing. You know, offshore wind costs in Europe went down like 50% last year. So costs are changing, policies change, but in order to reach those goals, we need at the government level and at the policy level, working with the private sector to figure out how to make those lines cross in the right places as we look out, as the dean was talking about, into the future, which I see every day when I look at my 9-year-old. The third thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to get off the stage, has been talked about a lot today, but I just went through it, and I'm still going through it to some extent, so I wanted to give a little bit of a case study, and then I'm happy to answer questions to the extent I can. December last year, Governor Cuomo announced that he was calling on the New York State Comptroller to divest the state retirement fund, which is a little over $200 billion. It's one of the, I think, top 5 biggest pools of money in the world of fossil fuel investments. You know, the comptroller likes to remind everybody that he is the sole trustee, and so he'll make the decisions. And so we're working closely with the comptroller's office to try to bring that around. However, we at NYSERDA said, well, we got a little pot of money here. We can try to show the way, which is what we do, right? We try to do it first so that others will follow. So we've got a $50 million, post-employment health benefit fund, as a lot of public benefit corporations in New York State do. Ones that, like the MTA, are a lot bigger. And so we went through a financial and legal analysis this spring in order to see whether we could reasonably recommend to our board of directors that as prudent and as sort of prudent fiduciaries, they could amend our investment policy statement to require that the managers of that fund divest to the extent possible from fossil fuels. And working with outside law firms and working with our investment advisor, we looked at a number of different funds. We're not direct investors, right? I mean, we don't go invest in, some energy storage company directly and take equity for our health benefit. We do it like a 401k, just like a lot of organizations. We look at index funds and different kinds of funds. We have to, as a fiduciary basis, be diversified across, different levels of the economy and geographies. What came through is that it would have been, our conclusion, frankly, was that, and to the surprise of our slightly stodgy investment advisor firm, which is just, an investment advisor firm that does this on a daily basis, the returns you can get from funds that are designated as low or no fossil fuel are better than the returns that you can get from normal funds. So when we did the math, it would have been irresponsible and probably a problem with respect to our fiduciary duties if we had not taken that action. All of our documents and analysis are public. I'm happy to share them with anybody. The question of how we bring businesses and large institutional investors, especially around to these sorts of decisions, is technical, it is financial, it is sort of what does ERISA say. It also has to do with what stakeholders have anxiety about. What holds back a lot of these decisions are certain large, stakeholders in the state who benefit from a retirement fund saying, you're going to completely change the way you've been investing money for the last 75, 100 years. That makes me really nervous. Please don't do it. I'm not interested in the numbers that you're going to tell me. I'm not interested in the sort of technocratic explanation with respect to what ERISA says. I'm interested in making sure that I, who am just a layperson, can feel secure in the future of my retirement benefits. And the same is true for common shareholders of large entities. And so what I think needs to happen, and is starting to happen more and more, and will happen if we can bring some of these large pools of funds, especially in the United States, because it's already happening in Norway or other places, start proving out the theory. Because I personally think that the impediments are just as much around sort of the political hesitation as they are having anything to do with the technical argument. And when you try to solve a political problem with a technical argument, it doesn't work all the time. I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions. And for the record, I think you saved the woodpecker by creating a market for the woodpecker.
Thank you, and thank you to our panelists. And we now have plenty of time for questions and answers. And because of that, I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first one. So, in fact, maybe two even. I don't know. We have plenty of time. And I have the microphone. No. So, Betsy. So, VLS divested. We divested. And I know that Exxon quaked in its shoes when we divested our tiny little amount of money that we had. I guess seriously, my question is, this whole? You outlined that the goal of these new types of entities was to combine the public purpose with the ability to raise capital. Is there any evidence that it's working? That such new entities actually are accessing sources of capital that are superior to what they had before?
So I would say that these entities in and of themselves, no, and that's why I'm saying these entities have confused me. Like they to try to solve, like the L3C was trying to solve an investment problem, and they have not. But the conversation has moved dramatically in the last 10 years, and we're hearing it over and over again. The companies that are doing good things, and a lot of them are C corporations, are doing better financially.
When you say C corporations, you mean normal
traditional,
for-profit,
traditional. In other words, well, I mean, this is a little kind of the opposite of this, the Pollyanna in me. But I am hoping we are actually moving to the place where you can't make money unless you're being responsible. And I would say it's, I had an argument with Mark about 10 years ago about, he says the environment is everything, and I say social enterprise is everything because every enterprise is a social enterprise. Some of them are just more responsible than others. I mean, have a positive impact, and some have a negative impact. And we need to not just divest from fossil fuels, but we need to invest in companies that are doing well across the line with their, there's so many nonprofits out there who are helping homeless people, and then their employees have to get their own services because they're not giving them enough money. I consider that a negative social impact. They're not, that you have to do well in all areas, but it's turning out. Consumers are getting more sophisticated, investors are getting more sophisticated, even employees are pushing the companies, you can't you can't keep doing these wrong things, and that is giving them the incentive to do better. And I think this morning the Unilever's brands that are the socially responsible brands are doing better than the other ones. So Brian is now helping Dove and Breyer's ice cream learn how to be better brands. So, I mean, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Well, Hannah, is there any evidence with this TCFD, is there any evidence that investors care, that they're listening. In other words, to use an example, if I'm going to buy stock in Exxon, I know damn well that, their stuff is in the ground and they've got to get it out to make money. And if I don't know it, my investment advisor will tell me. They don't have to disclose it for me to know that. Are investors really listening? Or is this like in California, we went through so much to get these cancer warnings. And they're everywhere. And their everywhereness means that it's part of the background. People don't see it. Is that a risk?
I do think that's a risk to some extent, and I think it depends on who you're talking about when you say investor.
Yeah.
The change right now is really at the institutional investor level. I don't know that we're at. There's various other areas that you all have talked about with divestment and other places where sort of individuals are taking part in that activity and are part of the push for that. I think for the larger corporations, larger companies, the fossil fuel industry, whether you or I think that we should invest in that for the greater good of the world isn't really going to have a major impact. But if BlackRock says they care about how you're considering risk, and it's not going to be the same thing as you should get out of your industry. It's going to be, how are you even thinking about these issues? How are you incorporating them into your planning processes? Are you going to exist in 30 years in a way that makes me profitable? And those questions are fundamentally different. And I think that they are changing the dynamic, and the evidence is that there are a lot of fossil fuel companies talking about these issues, not just publicly, but individually to others, seeking guidance on how this stuff works. Institutional investors have, TCFD itself is created and full of institutional investors and corporations. That is who created these recommendations. So it has a different impact than some of the other prior, sort of shareholder activisms. All of these things go hand in hand, and they all bring, along with the litigation, these are all part of the equation. But I think there are a certain subset, and it's a growing and larger subset and a more influential subset of investors that are looking at these issues differently, and that is what's changing corporate action.
Noah, before I ask you a question, did you have a comment on what she said?
Nope, she took it.
I don't know, Jim, whether this overwhelming optimism is. Well, my question for Noah is this. We all know that the current utility business model for utilities of whatever sort is, as long as the rate structure is what it is now, the way they make money is they sell power. The more power they sell, the more they make. And in fact, as I understand it, for many utilities, the rate is set, their actual rate per kilowatt is set based on certain modeling of the amount of power they're going to sell. And so if they exceed that, they'll do even better because they get that, 21 cents, or that's what it is in much of Vermont, or 18 cents or 15 cents, no matter how many kilowatt hours they sell, so the more the merrier. So for them, solar energy is anathema on people's houses because, for obvious reasons, and distributed generation. They're not going to like it when there's batteries in people's houses. So what is the alternative business model for the future of the utility? What is the utility of the future going to look like that these people can evolve to that is viable?
Well, if I had the answer to that question, I'd be making a lot more money. No, I think I know enough about regulatory rate making to be kind of dangerous. It's about what you pay the utilities for. What activities are you incentivizing through price signals and through requirements? And therefore, if you are setting a rate so that they are making money by selling fewer electrons, then they will make the choice to do that. If you are setting a rate so that they are making money by installing energy efficiency or subsidizing the installation of energy efficiency in their customers' homes, then they will do that. If you are setting rates so that I said this to you before, and most people don't know this, but we all pay for an energy system that runs at approximately 50 to 60% efficiency. What that means is that we pay 100% of the costs, and we only use on a regular basis about 55 to 60% of the energy system. So imagine if Amazon had a distribution system, and for all but 3 or 4 days of the year, 45% of the trucks, people, buildings or whatever were just sitting around doing nothing. And then they went to their investors and said, this is a good way for us to spend our money. Well, that would never fly. But it happens at the distributed electricity distribution level because of, I won't go into all the sort of historical reasons, but one of the things we need to do is incentivize them to make that system more efficient. What happens when we incentivize them to make that system more efficient is that they have to take on energy efficiency programs. They have to shave the peak. They have to engage in distributed generation solutions, and all of that becomes a value to them and to their shareholders and to the state and to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, I mean, that's sort of a theoretical answer. But that's the whole idea of what we're trying to do in New York. Now, easier said than done, and we've been at it now for 3 or 4 years, but it's going to take a long time to change a business model that's been around since, the 1920s.
Well, let me follow this on for 1 minute and sort of push a little. Okay, so there's rates that you could adopt theoretically that would compensate the utilities for doing the right thing. So through, I guess it's called performance-based rate making, you could pay people for installing energy efficiency, et cetera, and compensate them somehow. But at a certain point, there's nothing left. In other words, if you have a utility where suddenly they have long-term contracts for 100 units of power, and suddenly their customers are generating or saving 50, what are they going to do? I mean, at a certain point, what is the role of the utility if you have primarily distributed generation?
So first of all, load is only going up, it's not going down. I think it is. I think, it's probably folly to think that line on the graph is.
Because we'll electrify.
Well, because we're electrifying, because there are more people, because, people are using more electric stuff. So I think the idea that there are going to be fewer electrons to sell. Now, we'll try to level that off, right? Or maybe bring it down a little bit. But the kind of load reduction that you're talking about, I don't think will ever be a threat to the utility industry. What we want to do is change the incentives for them in terms of what they buy to fulfill the demand.
So, your turn, guys. Questions? Man, these people have been sitting too long. Yes, well, here, we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you. So thank you for all of your presentations. My question is if any of you have thoughts on sort of transboundary investments. And it sounds like there's a lot of thought of what Americans can do to influence investors in America on American businesses. But what if you're a country where there's a lot of inbound investment and you don't necessarily have control over the investors coming in or even the companies that are investing? What are some of the tools that they can have to still encourage the right kind of investment, sustainable investment, to build out their energy infrastructure, which might not exist or might be pretty dire?
Ladies and gentlemen, who wants to take this on?
Not me.
I'll give it a shot. This is the question of foreign direct investment, FDI.
It's all about the woodpecker, right? Yeah.
No, it's not. And then the question is, are there ways to affect this? Let's start with the negative case. Yes, you might have expected. I've got to play that role. So the negative case can be seen, and this is the lead up to the Enron and the California energy crisis of the early parts of this century. California decided in classic NIMBY, not in my backyard fashion, to be a pure energy importer. Now, why would you ever do that? Because you see, generating electricity in particular is dirty business, especially under a fossil fuel model or a nuclear model. And one way that you can do this is to make sure that everybody else, and that's not just Arizona, but also the state of Chihuahua in Mexico, winds up having to bear the immediate local burden of this. And this is actually a variation on the larger theme of the race to the bottom in international global environmental economics, and whether it makes sense, if there's anything in law that you can do to incentivize this. Well, using a combination of the renewable portfolio standard and feed-in tariff model in law, I mean, you can always just say, we refuse to credit this kind of investment toward the rate base. We refuse to allow you to recover if you do not engage in clean standards, and this clean standards applies without regard to the geography of your generation activities. Okay, so there is a way that you can use economic engagement with the broader world to raise rather than degrade environmental standards, right? So there are ways to use the kind of purchasing function of the utility as a way of incentivizing cleaner production. In fact, that was what PURPA is about. So PURPA, in its original conception, was to encourage qualifying facilities. What are qualifying facilities? Or cogeneration or small power production. Not always designed necessarily with environmental goals in mind. You can have a long discussion about how that was tilted for certain types of distributed generation. But if you pick your standards correctly and you actually have faith in the political process to actually get the standards right, the monopsonistic power that is concentrated in investor-owned utilities can be used to modify the behavior of smaller generators upstream in the electricity supply chain.
Can I just ask a question? So is the proposition that we run large-scale renewable solicitations for renewable energy credits. Lots of European companies in particular, and now for offshore wind, Statoil, right? Statoil has the biggest lease off the coast of Long Island. Is the proposition that we would say, you, European company, if you're doing something that we don't like in some other place in the world, we're not going to accept your bid for your development of clean energy here in New York?
Yeah, that's going to run headlong, assuming we remain members of the World Trade Organization, yeah. right into the tuna dolphin problem, right?
Right.
That you're basically exporting.
No, I'm just trying to understand what the proposition is.
No, he's suggesting that those countries themselves have the tools available to them. But I guess the questioner, am I right? You're concerned about lesser developed countries. About what?
Like, for example, the standards law.
What? Yeah. Picking on Mexico. I mean, the problem is the maquiladora problem is that, if you are importing things into the United States from Mexico, this is I'm going to be semper fi to NAFTA, not USMC, which is now the proposed name. I mean, if that's what it takes, is just change the name of the treaty so that Trump has a win, let's do that. Yeah. But USMC is a profoundly United States, Mexico, Canada is what he wants to call it. And he just obviously, having avoided the draft, does not know, that the halls of Montezuma, Semper Fi, that's really United States Marine Corps. But as long as we stay in that treaty and we stay in the broader system of global economic law, the World Trade Organization, you are perfectly within your rights to insist on the tuna dolphin problem. Let me just explain what the issue is. The product in the end is tuna fish. There is no truly clean way to harvest piscine meat. You're going to wind up disrupting ocean ecosystems no matter what you do. But the question was whether you are going to require the use of certain nets that have less bycatch so that it would be a less destructive way among destructive ways. The problem is that the World Trade rules aren't written to encourage the exportation of nicer environmental rules. They're written to encourage individual countries to say we are protective with respect to human health. And this is actually the rule that we've used thus far, now that we've basically caved on this and adopted the European approach to genetically modified organisms. If you really have a problem with GMOs, and this is Vermont and the home of this, I'm going to step out on a limb here, and again, I've already been targeted for denaturalization and deportation, so why not being expelled from Vermont as well? In for a dime, in for a dollar. If you really have a problem with genetic modification of food products, a label does you absolutely no good. It's as if saying, hi, plutonium is a dangerous food additive. You are warned this product contains plutonium. You have exactly one scientifically rational goal. You have to ban the stuff. And the reason we haven't banned the stuff is because you can't pony up the science that it actually threatens human health. You have any number of environmental reasons not to engage in plant-incorporated pesticides, but people are worried about their kids sprouting horns. You're using the wrong rationale for the correct result. The problem is that wrong rationales in a science-driven, evidence-based system of domestic Dormant Commerce Clause law or international trade law gets you defeated. So if you want to do this right, you need to actually engage the international trade law regime and kind of spin the post-tuna dolphin and say, look, maybe the result is electrons, but how you generate electrons matters. And you should be allowed to engage in a trade rule that says we insist on only buying clean or cleaner electrons. But here's the key. You have to be willing to sock it to your people. When you say most favored nation, it means America, if America is first, so is Mexico. Right? That's why we call them most favored nation, which again is one of these terms in law that doesn't make any linguistic sense. Most favored nation means no one gets a favor at all. And so to address your question directly, the legal mechanism that you would use is already there. It's like the line from Hey Jude, the motion you need is already on your shoulder. But you got to know how to flick it right. So the flicking it right means you have to convey to WTO and all the trading partners that we are willing to engage in what amounts to the NAFTA-style environmental rider or the labor rider. We want free trade. We want free trade on terms that are designed to offset the otherwise race-to-the-bottom degradation dynamic that we're afraid of. And if you'll commit to this, so will we, but we're going to maintain the equal treatment principle that is otherwise pervasive throughout international trade law.
Thank you. I did see some other hands here. Yes, you got the microphone coming.
Hi, thank you all again for your presentations. This one's mainly for Noah, but if anyone else wants to answer, please feel free to. So my question was, you brought up the idea of efficiency and like energies and stuff like that. And so the main thing, yes, is like with renewable energies is they aren't as efficient as well. Like that's why most investors aren't really going for them. So why focus on investors rather than like the scientific advancement of these renewable energies? Because like, yes, you know, in the past, like it has been very expensive and to produce like solar cells or like wind turbines and things like that. And then, but you know, with time, it's more of a time issue than that, you know, with the changing times and more advancing technology that we will get better, and they are getting better in this sense. So wouldn't putting money towards the scientific research be more of an incentive to the investors then to invest in the renewable energies since they will be getting better in that sense instead of like investing in the investors now?
I got it. Great question. I think the reality is that especially onshore wind and utility scale solar, because of all of the technical and scientific advancements over the course of the last 10, 15 years, are as inexpensive or less expensive than traditional generation right now. So yes, there are lots of other sorts of technologies that need to be improved, heat pumps, solar, hot water, you know, I don't know, somebody probably thinks they can solve fusion someday. You know, there are lots of scientific, you know, there's lots of scientific work going on, but we don't have the, frankly, we don't have the luxury of waiting for that. we have technologies right now that can solve the problem. The impediment is the scalability and investability. The impediment is how you can put it all on the electric system and still have a functioning society. The impediment is large financial institutions making decisions to invest in those technologies as opposed to others. So I don't, maybe small modular nuclear reactors will solve all our problems someday, but not for 50 years. And I'm sure that there are lots of problems with those that go. So I guess I don't know that I agree with the premise that that the technologies that we have right now can't do the work that we need them to do.
Other questions? Yes.
So I just have a question. It sounds as though Elizabeth and Hannah are kind of saying that, like, can people hear me? If people are moral agents, then they'll be able to change the environment and stuff like that. But I'm wondering about, like, NOAA, because I don't believe that people are, like, very moral in that sense, or corporations or investors or anything. But do you believe that, like, markets will self-correct as fossil fuels start to run out and stuff like that, or do you think that there absolutely needs to be some sort of resources?
Why choose? No, seriously, why pick one or the other? Why you have to do it all? Right?
Well,
I mean, you have to. I mean, in New York, for example, I was one of the designers of what we call the Clean Energy Standard, which requires that utilities purchase at least 50% of their energy from renewable sources by 2030. Mm-hmm. So that's a straight up mandate. You got to do it. If you don't do it, you'll be dinged and you'll lose a lot of money. While at the same time, we have a $5 billion fund to try to make sure that it makes fiduciary and financial sense for businesses to fulfill that goal. So you have to be doing the pulling and the pushing all at the same time.
And I'd like to add to that. I just want to echo the why choose. It's not in a vacuum. And when you talk about these changes in what institutional investors are considering important and how they're talking about things and what the pressure they're putting on them, on corporations, that does not come from nowhere. And it originated out of an environment that involved regulatory change. Right. And the Paris Agreement, the Clean Power Plan, the various other things were happening when this really got the ball rolling and got just far enough to be able to get further down the line. And they started to see not just the social good, but these things have real impacts on what's happening to the industries where we're invested in and their facilities. And it's not just about the fuel they're producing, it's about whether they can operate. So I think they go hand in hand. And if you look back through the history of how these types of things develop over time, there's a back and forth.
And I don't think it. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't think it's many of these investors. It's a moral choice. They think they're going to make more money if they, in a renewable energy than an Exxon, because Exxon's got all those risks that people were talking about this morning. So it's not a moral thing. It's actually a greedy one. But if it goes in the right direction, take it.
Let me connect areas of law here. The clean energy mandate in New York is the classic, it's the paradigmatic example of a renewable portfolio standard. And the equivalent of the RPS that we've seen in clean air regulation is CAFE, corporate average fuel efficiency. So why hasn't it worked? Why hasn't CAFE really incentivized this? Because there's such a thing as political economy. And because a concentrated industry such as automobile manufacturing with all sorts of patriotic pride, we don't want to import too many vehicles, et cetera, encourages these companies to have incredible political power, and you can always lobby for legislative retardation of these standards. And here's one very simple thing. Why do we see SUVs instead of minivans? Because SUVs dodge the CAFE standards partly, but here's the other one. Frankly, people are too vain to drive a vehicle that makes them look pregnant. I am being very serious about this. This is what the actual marketing data at the car manufacturers indicates. No one wants to draw. They want a big vehicle because Americans like big vehicles. But if you think about it, for the same fuel consumption, you can carry more people and actually be safer. Yes, safer in a minivan. And you can hardly buy a minivan in the United States. Why? Because American consumers, out of nothing more than vanity, have rejected the vehicle. So when you say there is an optimistic, oh yeah, we're going to do it, we're not going to do it at any meaningful personal sacrifice. We're not going to do it with any meaningful sacrifice to corporate profit. Let's get real about that. And until you change those two drivers, personal vanity at the consumer level and profit orientation at the corporate level, and they're not changing, that's my point. You're not going to be able just to wish markets into a solution.
Noah?
Thank you for talking about transportation. Everybody sort of heard about what happened in California with 100% renewables. It includes nukes, by the way. So it's 100% clean, not 100% renewable, or whatever they call clean. And it's, I think it's also really important to understand that our biggest challenge is no longer electric generation. Our biggest challenge is transportation. So in California, I think 18% of their emissions come from electric generation, 46 come from transportation. So, electric generation is big and chunky, right? It's you can take like a few coal plants offline and you've made a lot of progress. Transportation is way, way harder. People are buying more and bigger cars all the time. And electrification, I mean, I've got my plug-in parked outside, but it's great. You should all buy one. But it also involves the reformation of the distribution system because that's a lot more load coming on and you have to manage that. So what we see when people talk about carbon taxes, always ask the question, well, what sectors of the economy is your carbon tax actually going to encompass? Are we talking about electric generation? Because, okay, that's fine. We're kind of doing that already through a lot of cap and trade programs. Are you talking about transportation and what's the mechanism for doing that? Are you talking about buildings and single family homes? So like people up here who heat in the winter, this is a major impact on people's lives who are heating with home heating oils all over the Northeast and northern part of the United States. So you have to ask what sectors of the economy are you proposing to address? What is the pricing mechanism that you're going to use? What is your legal authority to actually do that? Because most states don't have it. And so you have to go through the FERC, which nobody's going to want to do anytime too soon because you're going to get the wrong policy. So, this question of how to address all of these different emissions problems, the transportation nut is probably the biggest one, and frankly, we all need to get a lot smarter and faster about addressing it.
My car, as an example, my car is a Ford C-Max that's a plug-in and gets about 60 miles per gallon. Ford has made the decision not to manufacture the C-Max. They're going to concentrate on trucks and SUVs, and that is a product of the absence of the right regulatory incentives. That's what happens. Victor, you had a question? Is there any other question? We have one more. Yes, we have 4 minutes here, so shoot.
Yeah, I was wondering how much of your $5 billion or how much work is being done to build the capacity of consumers to understand, like building, educating. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. How much work is being done to educate consumers and like focusing more on reduction in consumption at all?
I don't know the exact.
Want to repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was sort of what are we doing with our market development funding to change consumer behavior or to encourage consumers to be more educated to make better decisions? The answer is a lot. Although I will say that most of that is happening through utility programs. And so what the Public Service Commission does is say, hey, you utility, you have to, market to all your customers to buy Nest, thermostats, and you have to do it in XYZ ABC ways, and you have to subsidize it at this amount of money over this period of years. So there's a lot of that happens. On the softer side, especially with respect to emerging markets, it's really important, right? I mean, we all love emerging markets and we all think renewable energy and energy efficiency is great, but the truth is that a lot of the people who are getting into these, relatively unregulated new businesses can be a little, by the seat of their pants, and you have to keep an eye on them. And so we do a lot of work to make sure that contractors aren't selling, products and services to homeowners that are not going to, deliver the efficiency and renewable energy results that they're promising. We do a lot of work to try to educate, especially municipalities who are big customers, of what their opportunities are, whether it's renewable energy or otherwise. We have a whole program funded at about $500 million over the course of the 10 years, just focused on communities, and not only helping them understand what their best choices are, but also helping them design their own programs.
Thank you, and thank you to our panel, a wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We're just going to take a 15-minute break, so please help yourself to some cookies, some cold drinks, and some coffee. I'll see you at 2:45.